One of our great problems is that our Constitution is so old and so incomplete. And when it was first written in 1867, it was based on a whole lot of understandings that were simply taken for granted, so much so they weren't put into the Constitution. So it comes as a surprise to many to discover that the Prime Minister, our most important elected official, is not even mentioned in that document. So when it comes to how our elections are run, who gets to be chosen as Prime Minister, and what circumstances they have to leave or may be fired, it's all left to informal rules, practices, and understandings. And because of that, it's also open to a whole lot of misunderstanding, both in terms of simply getting things wrong, being misinformed and so on, but also misrepresentation by those actively involved in the political process. Now, I spoke of misunderstandings, and a very important misunderstanding has been repeated by our Prime Minister for some years now. And that is the view that the leader of the largest party has won the election. Not just has a right to try and form a government, not just a right to go and win the confidence of a House, but has won the election, implying that any action by the opposition parties to replace, remove that party from power is somehow anti-democratic. They're trying to undo the result of the election. Now, that position, the idea that the largest party has won the election and therefore has a right to rule, is one that I think has been quite widely accepted by those who study the issues and by many political commentators, that this is a misrepresentation. First of all, rule of thumb is we don't elect prime ministers. We don't even elect governments. We elect members of parliament. This election that's going on right now, we talk about as the election, but it is 338 simultaneous elections fought out in individual communities. And it's those people, those 338 men and women will go to Ottawa, and it's on their shoulders to decide ultimately who will govern. What we do on election day and the results of election night are so crucially important. But in many circumstances, they are only part of a process. And the process of an election and choosing a government is only settled by a government winning a vote of confidence in the House of Commons. So, when we look at what they should or shouldn't be doing, have a pause to see what Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Mulcair have said, and they've come closest to what I would argue is the correct position by saying whoever the leader of the largest party gets to try to form a government to test the confidence in the House. Both have also acknowledged a widely accepted premise that the incumbent Prime Minister has a right to meet Parliament as well, provided no other party has won a majority of seats. It's universally accepted that the Prime Minister must resign if another party wins a majority. But what happens if no party has won a majority? It's often suggested that a blanket rule is the leader of the largest party has the right to form the government. Is it the right to govern, as Mr. Harper would suggest, or the right to simply meet Parliament, test its confidence, and so on? This has the benefit of simplicity and reflects past practice, but I question whether it is an absolute rule. And the problem is that universal application of this principle runs counter to political realities as they've been evolving and what I see as the principles of parliamentary government. Minority governments used to be informal arrangements between two parties or a prime minister playing off opposition parties. But the events of 2008 with that possible coalition government changed all this. And we opened up a discussion on the legitimacy and nature of a variety of minority and coalition government arrangements. We can now expect a public statement on how a government would be formed, maybe even a written document of agreement between the political leaders. We already have statements from the Liberal and NDP leaders saying they would not support Mr. Harper in a minority government. By implication, then, we would expect them to say they would support, one would support the other. So what would happen if they win a majority of seats between them and announce on election night or soon afterwards that they have a commitment to form a government, most likely a minority government? To answer this, we need to look at the principles involved. Number one, and the most important one, authority to govern comes from a majority of elected members in the House of Commons. That's what our system of government is based on. Number two, we do have a Governor General who acts as a kind of referee, but it's very important that the Governor General intervenes as little as possible and, to the extent possible, leaves it up to our elected politicians to sort things out. The Governor General's intervention is a last resort. I would suggest some guidelines on how government formation should occur from this. Number one, the Prime Minister does have a right to meet Parliament, the incumbent Prime Minister, unless another party has a majority. The Governor General's discretion to appoint a new Prime Minister only arises when the incumbent resigns. Dismissal of the existing Prime Minister is your absolute last resort. If the Prime Minister resigns, the Governor General's duty is to appoint the party leader who is most likely to win the support of the House of Commons. So who would that be? Well, if there's no public agreement among other parties, then the leader of the largest party should be appointed as Prime Minister. They get to try it out, in my view. However, it's quite possible that opposition parties could announce they have an agreement amongst themselves, and together they would have a majority of seats. And in that case, the Prime Minister should resign, in my view. As soon as it's made clear that the Prime Minister would, in fact, be defeated when Parliament meets, he should resign. A majority is a majority.
We elect a House of Commons, we don't elect a government. A government's formed based on which party or parties have the support of that House of Commons. Ever since Canada first achieved responsible government, as they called it, in 1848, it's been understood that a ministry appointed to office must have the support of, be responsible to, the House of Commons, or the Legislative Assembly as it was then. And this convention has held good ever since. This important constitutional milestone heralded the beginning of Canadian autonomy over internal matters, and so in that sense was probably a bigger watershed than Confederation itself. Since 1848, the basics haven't changed. If an administration is sustained by the House of Commons, in general, that's what confers legitimacy. The Governor General's role is to facilitate legitimate government, and usually that's very straightforward. The Governor General is the one who swears an administration into office, might seem to pull the strings, but in fact he's guided by the simple principle of responsible government. His goal will always be to allow the House of Commons to decide. Only the House of Commons can sustain a ministry in office. If an administration is defeated in the Commons on a confidence vote, something like the speech from the throne or the budget, this would either trigger an election, or if one's been held very recently and there's an alternative available, the Governor General might call upon the leader of the other leading party to ask if he has enough parliamentary support to form a government, and if so, swear them into office. Only very rarely would the Governor General's reserve powers be invoked, for example, in refusing the advice of his ministers. We've had a number of minority federal governments in our history. In fact, we had a long run between Diefenbaker's big progressive conservative majority in 1958 and Pierre Trudeau's majority liberal comeback in 1980, when we were as like as not to have a minority government. In the 7 elections between those years, 5 resulted in minority governments. But in all instances in those years, it happened that the party that won the most seats formed the government. It worked out that way, but this shouldn't obscure the fact that it need not be so. The most interesting episode in this respect came in 1925. You probably knew I was coming to that. Liberal Mackenzie King had been prime minister since 1921, but his party came second in the 1925 election with 99 seats in a 245-member House of Commons. Worse yet, King lost his own seat. Arthur Meehan and the Conservatives won more, 116 seats, but not enough for a majority. The Progressive Party and others captured 30. Most assumed the Conservatives would form a government. In fact, that's what the Governor-General, Lord Byng, expected would happen. But King was confident he could hold on to power because the Progressives opposed Conservative tariff policy, and Byng correctly agreed to let him try. King gained a seat in a by-election and in the short term successfully carried on. The Progressives supported the Liberal budget, and 2 Labour MPs were won over with a promise to introduce old age pensions. King was audacious in declining to surrender the reins of government after the 1925 election, but there was nothing constitutionally illegitimate in what he did. If he had the support of the Commons, he was within his right. The subsequent 1926 controversy muddies the waters, but if the original question is, did King have the constitutional right to hold onto power after the 1925 election? The answer is yes, as long as his party could sustain the support of the House of Commons. But of course, there's another dimension to things beyond what's constitutionally legitimate, and that's what's politically prudent, what people expect ought to happen. Media coverage on election night would almost certainly lead people to expect to see the leading party form the government, and any leader acting contrary to those expectations would probably have to combat the perception that he was attempting something a bit dodgy. We can think back, for instance, on some of the comments made in December 2008 when the Liberals and the NDP attempted to form a coalition with Bloc Québécois support to topple Harper's Conservative minority. There was absolutely nothing constitutionally wrong with this, but the move was characterized as desperate, reckless, a power grab, a coup, even the politics of a banana republic. I can think of an earlier historical episode when defying public expectations was politically costly. In early 1958, the new Liberal leader, Lester B. Pearson, made an ill-conceived common speech in which he challenged John Diefenbaker, who was then presiding over a minority government, to resign, and suggested that the Governor-General should call upon the Liberals to form a government. The Liberals had just had a long run in office from 1935 to 1957, and under Louis Saint Laurent had shown some of the sense of entitlement that voters love to punish. Among the worst offenders was Liberal Cabinet Minister C.D. Howe, who liked to refer to parliamentary question period as the children's hour, and who used the procedural device of closure to push pipeline legislation through in 1956. Faced with Pearson's challenge in 1958, instead of resigning, Diefenbaker requested and was granted a dissolution and went on to hand the Liberals a shellacking in the ensuing election.
My focus is on what lies ahead in the period following the election on October the 19th, assuming of course, that we are in a minority situation, which, judging from the current polls, is not necessarily a sure thing. But nonetheless, let's hope that there's a minority. Not that I want to deny Mr. Harper a majority, it's just minority governments are just much more interesting. A lot more interesting questions. And among the interesting questions is that among them are, what form will it take? How long can it be sustained? Those are some of the open questions. And furthermore, rather than a minority government, could we see a coalition government for the first time since 1920? In dealing with these questions, I would like to suggest three things. First, in the Canadian context, there is a lack, at least in my view, a lack of settled constitutional doctrine, whether in the form of conventions or otherwise, on minority government formation. Instead, there appears to be a competition between different conventions, norms, and practices. Second, I would argue, prevailing public opinion plays an important role in determining both the behavior of political parties and decisions made by the Governor General. And third, many, I believe, underestimate the capacity of Stephen Harper to manage and sustain a minority government, notwithstanding the categorical denials by the leaders of the Liberals and the NDP that there's no conceivable way that they could support a Conservative minority. Well, first then, in the case of conventions, there is no, in my view, firm consensus on what the conventions are or should be. I fully agree with Andrew Hurd that the incumbent Prime Minister has the right to see if he can command the confidence of the House after if his government is reduced to minority, or even if his or her party is reduced to second or third place. Further, that the party with the largest seat share after the election does not automatically win the election. I certainly agree with that. However, the actual practice and behavior of prime ministers over the years who find themselves in the position of being in second or third place in a hung parliament has been, with the one exception in 1925 with Mackenzie King, to walk over to Rideau Hall and turn in their mandate and recommend to the Governor General that the leader of the largest party enjoying the plurality of seats be invited to attempt to form a government to see if they can command the confidence of the House. So in this regard, it's worth noting that currently all three leaders, Mr. Harper, Mr. Mulcair, and Mr. Trudeau, have indicated that this is what they will do or expect Mr. Harper to do should he slip to second or third place. It's also possible that Mr. Harper's attack on the proposed coalition of the Liberals and the NDP back in 2008, with support from the Bloc, when Mr. Harper boldly stated that the party with the plurality of seats, quote, wins the election, quote, and that the proposed coalition was illegitimate, if not treasonous, has permanently shaped the public narrative. So I think that may also be the case. Certainly at that time, public opinion was very strongly supportive of Mr. Harper continuing, and also if there were an election to be held, he would have won with a majority, and highly negative on the proposed coalition. In brief, the belief and practice of considering the leader and party with the largest seat share in a minority parliament to have won the election may not have the status of a full-fledged convention and may indeed contravene parliamentary convention. But nonetheless, I believe it will have a powerful effect on what the current Prime Minister will do and what public opinion will expect him to do. Now, on the management of minority governments, it should be stressed that the minority governments headed by Mr. Harper, and especially the one from 2008 to 2011, were quite different from the ones headed by Lester Pearson in the 1960s and Trudeau in the 1970s. The hallmarks of the Pearson-Trudeau minority governments was a high level of cooperation and behind-the-scenes negotiations with the other parties, and mainly between the Liberals and the NDP, with also the Creditistes being thrown into the mix. And also the elevation of Parliament as an arena where committees and MPs could do effective work in shaping legislation. The Harper minority governments have been quite different and have been characterized by attempting to minimize the role of Parliament, for example, reducing the scope of parliamentary committees and the way they were managed, less cooperation with other parties, greater reliance on brinksmanship, both with Parliament and also the Governor General, and pushing the constitutional limits on issues such as prorogation. In brief, Mr. Harper has been quite effective in managing and sustaining a minority situation using quite different techniques from his predecessors. We can sort of briefly sketch some scenarios here. If Mr. Trudeau comes out ahead, then we could perhaps see a repeat of the 63, 68, 72, 74 eras, with the NDP supporting a Liberal minority government in return for Liberals agreeing to accept certain key NDP initiatives, perhaps related to daycare or farmer care, for example. Similarly, an NDP-led government following an NDP plurality could well gain the support of the Liberals, although I think here the relationship might be a little testier if Mr. Mulcair were in charge, or the governing party, particularly on issues such as trade agreements. Both Mr. Mulcair and especially Mr. Trudeau appear lukewarm on the idea of a formal coalition. Now, the interesting question is what happens when the Conservatives gain the plurality of seats? First, Mr. Harper would likely exercise his right to meet Parliament. Before doing so, however, he could well use his demonstrated capacity for pushing the rules and conventions to the limit as to when to meet Parliament, when to present a budget, throne speech, and so on. Particularly if it is a fairly wide gap between the Harper Conservatives and the other two parties, if Mr. Harper comes close to a majority, then I think he would be very strongly tempted to do precisely that, to push the conventional limits of how long he can wait before meeting with party. Then we have the statements recently made by Mr. Mulcair and Mr. Trudeau, not the ones on who should have the right to form a government after election, but whether they would support a Conservative minority. Both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Mulcair have said they would not. In fact, I think Mr. Mulcair, as Mr. Mulcair put it, there wouldn't be a snowball's chance in hell that he would do so. Right. Might either Mr. Mulcair or Mr. Trudeau blink? Might Mr. Trudeau, who appears slightly more flexible on things like trade, Bill C-51, might he succumb to the lure of amended C-51 offered as an olive branch by that nice Mr. Harper? If the Conservatives do go down on a confidence vote, would Mr. Harper advise the Governor General to invite Mulcair or Trudeau to try their hand?
Has this happened in Canada? Has a Governor General ever refused to honor a Prime Minister's request for dissolution?
Well, the only post-Confederation example is the famous one that constitutional experts trot out anytime people talk about conventions, and that's Lord Byng refusing King's advice in 1926. That's the only post-Confederation one. There was one in pre-Confederation era in 1858, but nobody seems to care about that one because it's pre-Confederation. That there was indeed one in 1858 too. Yeah.
Was Governor General Michaëlle Jean right or wrong when she acceded to the Prime Minister's request to prorogue Parliament when the opposition parties were going to do a vote, everyone knows that next day, to form a viable government? And if Harper wins a minority, whether it's a plurality close to majority or not, whether he takes time to work things out, would it be right or wrong for the Governor General to accept his desire for dissolution if the opposition parties were to present a viable government option to the Governor General?
Okay. Answer to first question, yes. I believe Mikhail Jean was right. I think Andrew is going to tell you otherwise, I believe. But no, maybe not. Okay. Yeah. I believe that the Governor General can see plenty of things that stink on ice and just has to say, well, my job is not to force better behavior. My job is to allow the House of Commons to sort it out, and the prorogation was unseemly, but it didn't permanently prevent the verdict of the House of Commons. It delayed it. I think that in the second circumstance you describe, that would be a subversion of the will of Parliament, and I think at that point he at this point would be correct in refusing advice to dissolve if there was a viable alternative ministry and it was within a very short interval.
Any others? I know I'm among the minority in academics saying this, but I vociferously say the Governor General was wrong in refusing, in going along. To me, her role should have been allow the politicians, the political institutions in general to resolve this issue, not allow one key player to do so, particularly since this was immediately after the election. Parliament was still sorting it out. We had a very clear and unprecedented agreement among the parties signed by a majority of MPs. To me, this is very different from many other situations, and one in which the political institution should have been allowed to play it out. And on the second one, yes, I agree.
If we have a minority government, and if Harper decides to wait a very long time to recall Parliament, what recourse is there, either judicially within the Governor General, and is there a limit at how long that recall, how long the delay can be?
I think it will be mainly an issue of supply, the government running out of money. At that point, they would have to go to Parliament.
Yeah, there's a legal limit of 12 months between settings in the Constitution. So the House would have to be recalled by the end of July next year, but there's a practical question whether you could do that. That would depend on the intricacies of the Financial Administration Act.
But sometimes it's been said that we don't know anything about what happens in the Governor General's office, that it's kind of a black box, you know, and I think there are times when informal discussions take place, you know, about such things, the length of a prorogation, for example, the timing of things like that, and we don't hear about that, and maybe that's just as well. But I think that in a scenario like what you described, there would probably be a conversation between the Governor General and the Prime Minister, saying, you know, this is, it would be an unacceptable delay. Yeah.